So, welcome everyone to Connected Learning TV. I'm Eidman-Aadahl. I'll be your host for this, which is the third in a series of Connected Learning webinars where we've been looking at writing and making, and especially how the Connected Learning principles provide a framework for thinking about innovation across all kinds of educational contexts and learning environments. These webinars are part of the Summer of Making and Connecting, and in particular are connected to a MOOC right now about connected learning that you can find if you're interested by searching the hashtag CLMOOC. Now, today we're following up on last week's webinar, and this is one that looked at the connected learning focus on interest-driven learning. And after some thinking about interests and passions, some discussion in the chat room about the differences or similarities between them, we started to think about the question, well, how does following an interest get you somewhere in a connected learning environment? How can you follow an interest and have it lead someplace? So obviously we're playing around with a big metaphor when we talk about leading and following, and that's the metaphor of the path or the trajectory. So today we want to explore that idea that there might be something like a learning pathway. That's what we're going to look at today. How do learners, questions like how do learners create a pathway for themselves? How do they follow a pathway in their learning? How do we as educators design pathways that people can follow that, quote, get them somewhere? And what does that even mean? And we have a great series of guests today who probably are going to unpack that, and we're going to see if this metaphor actually gets us anywhere as practitioners. So we're going to bring these guests on in a second, but first a couple of quick details. If you're watching on the live stream channel right now, please jump into the chat room, introduce yourself, and start chatting with the folks that are there, connect with each other. We'll try to keep an eye on that chat room and bring in some questions from there as we can. Now, speaking of that, if you're connected, you might also want to see that you're watching a Google Plus Hangout. And speaking of Google Plus, there's a connected learning community on Google Plus. It's growing really rapidly. It's a little over 2,000 members about now, I would say. And we'd love for you to be part of the conversation there as well, to follow up on these webinars and see more. And also, there's a group notes Google Doc today. If you're in the live stream chat and you're watching, feel free to jump into the Google Doc. Help us make a collaborative record of our learning here. All of those resources, the chat, the Google Doc, things like that, will be archived and available at Connected Learning TV. Okay, enough with that. Let's introduce our guests. All the way on at least my left, I'm guessing viewers yours as well, is Anna Smith. Anna is a teacher educator, educational researcher. She's currently completing her doctoral studies at NYU and is the co-author of Developing Writers, Teaching and Learning in the Digital Age. And then moving down past me to my right, Kris Gutierrez. Kris Gutierrez is Professor of Literacy and Learning Sciences at the University of Colorado Boulder. And her research examines learning in designed learning environments. And she's had a particular attention to students from non-dominant communities and English language learners. And many of you are familiar with her work on third spaces and syncretic approaches to literacy learning. In a way, that's a lot about pathways too, Kris, I guess, between home and school and out of school. So she also is going to bring that research, which is part of the Connected Learning Research Network. And then all the way down on the side there, returning from last week's webinar, we have Paul Allison. Paul helped us think about what interest-driven learning looks like, and he's well known as a teacher in the Bronx, New York, and host of Teachers Teaching Teachers on the EdTech Talk Network, also well known for Youth Voices. Right now, Paul is live from the scene. If we can see around him both a lot of youth who are working on projects, and to his side, Vanessa Generelli of Peer-to-Peer University. Vanessa and Paul together are working with young people in a Youth Voices summer program where they're actually, in a way, thinking about this pathways question through the design of a badge system. So it's a fabulous webinar, and folks, we need to start hearing from the guests, so enough from me. Thank you all for joining us. And if we could kick it off, Anna, with you. Your research really in some ways inspired us to look at this question. Your looking at young people and their following an interest through a variety of pathways. So could you give us an overview of your research and a bit of what you've observed in watching young people follow their interests?
Sure. So I guess first a nod to other people who are researching learning pathways might be a nice way to kick off, because if the concept learning pathways is new to those that are joining us today, it's not new around the world. There's some great work out of Norway and the UK about learning lives. So if you've been following Learning Lives Project or Everyday Literacies, those are on the same vein. Also in the US, Learning Geographies and how meaning moves across time scales. So if you've been following any of that work around education, it's in the same vein. And of course we have Kris Gutierrez today with us, and her approach to horizontal learning is also in the same vein. So just we'll have some links about those later, but that's just, if you've been hearing about that it's the same, similar concepts. So I thought today we could start unpacking this concept of learning pathways by looking at the saying, life is a journey, not a destination. And I think if we're talking about learning pathways, we're having a conversation about how learning is a journey, not a destination. And I think we're hyper-focused in education right now on those destination markers. Our curriculum, our standards, our assessments. Learning is being defined in relationship to destination markers. And what counts as learning is being confined by that. We even see that in out-of-school in informal learning spaces, that their funding is determined by how well they align to school-based destination markers. So if we shift the focus to look at the journey or the pathways that youth are making across time and across their learning context, we can start asking a little bit different questions about the quality of education and equity. So instead of just who has and hasn't learned, which is an important question we won't stop asking, we can also start asking, though, things like when, where, and what types of learning opportunities are being presented, to whom along the way, who's driving and directing learning toward that destination, how responsive is the environment to the learning processes that are taking shape while they're taking shape. And I think those are some interesting new questions that we can ask. And I think another piece to unpack then too is that as we're looking at learning pathways, we're widening the lens of where and when we're considering learning to take place. If we're classroom teachers or out-of-school mentors or volunteers, we often concern ourselves with the learning that's occurring within the four walls of our responsibility, right? Or within the time frame, the 4 to 6 p.m. when my program runs. And but learners cross multiple contexts throughout the day and are learning in each of those contexts, and they're taking with them their learning and their identities and their interests. And as they go into different contexts, those interests are valued and acknowledged differently, but they can't put them away. They travel with us. And this goes into homes and online communities and local community centers. So I think it's important for us to ask how learning is taking shape as we're moving across contexts and how we're responding to each context's differing configurations of people and practices and the different power dynamics that are in different places, and how that's affecting our learning. Right. And also, though, what I've learned then is if we're looking beyond our four walls, we in turn are actually understanding better what's happening within our four walls and within the time frame that we feel responsible for, because we have this bigger picture of what this learner is doing as they move across learning pathways.
And what you just said reminds me also of another sort of metaphor that in connected learning we use a lot, which is that school or after school or whatever is the practitioner space that we're thinking about is really only one node on a learner's learning network. Mm-hmm. And how empowering it can be to actually see that. Not that you have a burden, an extra burden, by having to think larger, but you can understand your little space better by understanding how it is connected to everything else.
Yeah. And I think that, yeah, go ahead.
No, please go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, you had asked about the research that I was working on right now, and I became interested in learning pathways. I didn't have a name for it, but I became interested in that when I was a full-time classroom teacher. And in my classrooms were several young men who were amazing writers. They wrote beautiful and moving poetry. They had there was a group of them who had an underground newspaper that was very effective in wreaking havoc in the school. I also saw young men writing that to make change in the city government, the way they use recreational spaces. So I saw all these examples of great young men who were writers, and I couldn't make sense of that these were the same young men who were contributing to the 20-point deficit between young women writers and young men writers on NAEP assessments. And so I wanted a new way to understand what was happening and to represent their learning and their writing development. So I actually wanted to see if I could do this. I wanted to show you what I've been working on the last few years. Let me do this screen share here. So I've had the privilege to work with 4 young men here in New York City and to trace their writing development or their learning pathways in school and out of school. So over time, what I've been doing is collecting over about 2 years' time. Oh, let's see if I can do that again. And you don't need to read this. I just wanted to visualize, give you a visual of what I've been doing. I've been looking at different aspects of their writing, so the technologies they're using, their writing processes, their products, their craft techniques that they've been using, and collecting data then that was occurring in multiple contexts, so not just school and one out-of-school organization, but multiple out-of-school organizations as they moved across time. And then I was looking at how then these different processes or products or purposes were changing across time. So what was the shape of this pathway? So which of these interacted with each other, and what was the dynamic? So which things were increasing and decreasing? Which practices were ceasing altogether? And in which context and under in which conditions? So you can imagine. Let me flip back to this screen here. Okay, so you can imagine that there were a lot of findings that we could talk about learning pathways. So what I picked out that I wanted to bring up, and this is maybe something we can talk about that relates to last week's webinar on interest-driven learning, and that was that a lot of times the young men, even if they were granted institutional power or not to make decisions about what they did, they were really directing their learning. And that was a lot of times in relationship to their aspiring literate identities, what I call their aspiring literate identities, so who it is that they wanted to be and what they wanted to do as writers. And that really influenced which practices they took up from school and not school. So just as a quick example, one young man, Patrick, wanted to be a page poet. He didn't call it that at first, but what happened is he went to an out-of-school organization that's in spoken word, and an adult mentor there compared him to Yusef Komunyakaa, I think is how you say his name. He's an established award-winning poet. And that night Patrick went home, looked it up online, and was impressed, right, to say the least, with Yusef Komunyakaa, and felt moved that he was compared to him, and immediately really wanted to be like Yusef Komunyakaa. And so he started this practice of intense reading. He built a bookshelf. He started to spend his money on books. He bought his first book with Yusef Komunyakaa. And then he also, as he was reading, he was really struck by the way that poets on the page could create meaning by the way they structured their pieces on the page. And so he took up the practice from school on annotating and close reading that he had been taught for years, right? And those books were filled with these annotations, and he was intensely studying how these authors did this with their writing. To his teacher's dismay, he did not begin to annotate the work that he was required to annotate in school, right? But the practice of annotation was one that he took up for his own study and practice. He, in fact, was considered a lazy writer in school and referred to himself as a lazy writer in school. And they saw him as someone who wasn't living up to his potential. They also did not know that he was intently studying multiple authors outside of school. So oftentimes we tell stories like this about how school isn't meeting his needs and it's disconnected, and we imagine out-of-school organizations are much better, and not to disparage this out-of-school organization because it was great, but it's just not that simple, because at the same time, Patrick was attending an out-of-school organization that had writing workshops, which he began to, well, he decreased in his attendance of those. He actually stopped altogether attending the formal writing workshops. They weren't meeting his new literate identity around being a page poet and what they were studying. But he was there all the time at the organization. And what he was doing, he was catching adult mentors before and after these workshops to sit down with them and pick their brains about writing craft, the names for line breaks and certain decisions they would make. He would interview them about their writing process. And in fact, he took over our interviews. As the study went along, about midway, he would begin to start an interview by saying, here's what I brought today, and this is what I want to talk about, right? So my questions were on the side. So he was using all of these school and out of school contexts as a bank of resources from which to draw to meet his needs and his interests. And all the young men did this similarly. And sometimes they would just let the resources accrue, right? They may not use it, they just let it accrue. So connecting back to this idea of interest-driven, I often hear us talk about certain topics or fields of study as what's driving interest. But we can also be talking about who we're interested in being as something that drives our work, and what we're interested in doing. So as a last quick example, here's a piece that Patrick wrote in his, is that screen share working?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this is a piece that you don't need to read the whole piece. There's a quote from it, but this is a piece that Patrick wrote towards the end of the study. He met with an adult mentor at a coffee shop, and it was the first time he went to a coffee shop, and he was quite moved as he looked around and saw writers, right, all with their on their laptops writing, and he felt like that he wanted to start using the coffee shop as a learning space. Not because it had a great ambiance, but because it was really teaching him what it meant to be a living writer. And so in the middle of this piece is this line. He says, I imagine their bodies writing all that I am. I say to myself, I'm here too. So I begin typing, trying to keep up with who I aspire to be.
Wow. I think that probably folks are really going to want to pick up on a whole series of threads, I can imagine. Before we turn it over to some other guests, just some quick pieces. I think that this, both the experience that you've had, the ability to really follow closely some learners, is in some ways a practitioner's dream. I mean, I think a lot of us have, wished that what we could do is really just sort of hover about and follow and see what young people do, what they bring into our space, what they take from our space. And this piece that you talk about is it's more complex than. And young people who are eagerly pursuing something, they're using learning resources, I think was a phrase you used, from a whole range of places. They're drawing skills from their schooling, from their after schooling, from what they encounter on the web or elsewhere. So that's a really rich set of insights. And I wonder if, before we move on to our next guest, if you were to boil that down to a piece or two, you're also a teacher educator, a piece of advice that you would give to folks working in learning spaces, what would be, from this, take this insight? What kinds of things would you say?
That's a good question. I think that we can trust youth that we work with that they want to learn. We know this as teachers. They want to learn, and we can trust them that they are learning. And we take breaks, and I'm sure they'll take breaks as well. But because their learning is being driven by interests that they may be able to articulate or not, we can trust them to want to learn and to be learning in those spaces. And I think also that even whether or not we feel like we have control in a space, I guess being trusting in the ecosystem and in learning that indicators to us in the past that we've used for control, for thinking that we have control over what's being learned and how it's being learned, weren't there to be. I don't know how to say that. They're false indicators of our control over anyway, and we need to be okay with that.
It's powerful. Thank you. Kris, you were having a little bit of technical difficulties, but you look like you might be.
I hope it's working now.
You sound great. I can just imagine you want to pick up on a million things. So I'm just going to say, talk to us.
Well, first of all, Anna raises so many important points, and it's such exciting work that I'd love to just have an offline conversation with her for a long time. So I hope I can pick up on some, but I wanted to actually start out with raising a couple of cautions about some of the metaphors that we're using. And there are things that I struggle with not only as a researcher, designer, but as a teacher. And so let me just think aloud. I'm really just thinking aloud with you, so I have to. This is a wonderful opportunity to just do some throat clearing, right? Because we're all really thinking about this new work, and being part of the Connected Learning Research Network has just afforded me so many opportunities to kind of think anew with so many wonderful people. I wanted to just say that in the room with me is Joanne Iskin, who is a longtime collaborator, my in research and friend and co-thinker. She was the principal of the school that I worked in for over 15, nearly 20 years, and then assistant superintendent. So I want to give a shout out to Joanne Iskin, who always makes me think better. So here's some of my cautions. Learning pathway. And I like the way we're thinking about pathways. I think it has a lot of affordances, and so I'll come back to that in a minute. But one of my cautions is that learning pathways suggests a kind of linearity, a kind of straightforward movement, as it were, as if learning is smooth and uncomplicated and not recursive at all, right? And so I think we want to think about the ways in which learning, right, is much, much more multidimensional and complicated and with a lot of fits and starts. And so if we
rhizomatic pathways.
I'm sorry?
Sorry. I just said rhizomatic pathways.
Yes, absolutely. That's yes, let's pick up on that. So how can we as teachers and people who are thinking about this, keep it in mind when we're trying to really flesh out this metaphor? How do we convey this wonderful messiness and complication with learning? That pathways and trajectories sometimes can miss, right? So I'm going to come back to that. So I want to just start with just a couple of these. So the other caution I have is what we do with interest-driven learning, right? And so in my work, I talk about repertoires of practice, right? And which involves students' interest-driven kinds of sensibilities and expertise and practices. And in a minute, I want to talk about how important that is. But in some of the conversations, especially in the time of Common Core, that I hear is there's two main dangers that I just want to again bracket. One is, how do we not romanticize? Let me just say, back up and say, I'm profoundly interested in issues of equity, and I'm profoundly interested in the possibilities that youth have, particularly youth from non-dominant communities, but all youth, the possibilities that they could have. And so I want to think about interest-driven in a way that doesn't reify those practices or romanticize those practices, but rather enriches the way we think about those practices. And at the same time, interest-driven should involve, how do I extend those practices? How do I extend those interests in ways that push people against their own levels of competence, that help them develop these new identities in new spaces, so that we're not just, again, thinking about the interest-driven, right, in that traditional way. And then I think it's real important to not also think about interest-driven as being frozen in time, right? So when we introduce kids to new practices, they take on new They experiment, right? I think ingenuity and creativity are fundamental human practices, right? And so I think we want to think about how we can nurture these for youth so that they're always stretching and pushing. And I'm particularly concerned about this in the time of Common Core, that while it offers so many wonderful, wonderful possibilities, I'm very concerned with how do we ratchet up learning for these youth who've been in spaces that keep them in reductive forms of literacy learning, right? Remedial kinds of programs. How do we use this learning pathways and interest-driven kinds of concepts to ratchet up learning for these youth so they can be part of this wonderful opportunity of Common Core? And one of the discussions, which is not for today, but I want to put on the table, Elise, that I know your wonderful colleagues are always thinking about, and that is, what does remediation look like in the time of Common Core?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that thinking about learning pathways and interest-driven offers a wonderful opening for us to redefine what counts as scaffolding, what counts as support to get youth into fully participating across various domains, including school. Okay?
Yeah.
So that's all a preamble, because I want to make sure that we're pushing against our own metaphors.
Kris, that's very important because we're using these metaphors for their affordances to help us see something, but every way of seeing is also a way of not seeing. Right. And all these metaphors have serious histories.
Right.
Curriculum itself comes from the sense of the course, the race course, the path.
Right.
And so when we talk about pathways, we're also leveraging a whole history of control mechanisms as well as open mechanisms.
Right. Right.
And a whole history of work with non-dominant youth that basically says we will tell you what your interests are. They are the ones we stereotypically associate with people like you. Go study that, while more dominant youth are running a different course.
Right.
So you're right to name all these. Thank you.
Right. So I think this is a wonderful opportunity. I guess I'm framing it not as a problem but as an opportunity to see how we can, as we continue to theorize and practice and design for this, that we can think about these complications in ways that push us forward. Okay. So having said that, you know, I've used the metaphor in one previous seminar about learning as movement. And for me, I like that because I think that forces us to think about that learning is, a few years ago, a bunch of us wrote this piece in which we talked about learning being lifelong, life-wide, and life-deep, right? And I think that those, again, are important metaphors to think about, so that when we're designing curriculum, when we're creating scaffolds for student learning, we are always thinking about these dimensions that, you know, time scales are important. What do people learn across, it's fundamental to their development, their identities across the lifespan. And life-wide, for me, is what takes hold as people move across the various ecologies and practices of their everyday life. And that's the part that we have missed in terms of school-based learning, right? How do we leverage that life-wide or horizontal kinds of expertise? And then there's the life-deep kind of learning. And that's the kind of learning we call vertical, or it's the kind of learning that when you're trying to learn a disciplinary domain deeply, right? All of those are so important in terms of consequential learning, right? We're all here interested in consequential learning. So how can we start thinking about those multiple dimensions, right, in our work, life-wide, lifelong, and life-deep? And I'm concerned about it because there are a lot of youth who are very resourceful themselves in forging new learning pathways. We see examples of that all over our lives. But there's a lot of youth whose And privileged families know how to organize for that. So I'm going to take a little sidebar. For 7 years, I was part of a wonderful study here at UCLA on the everyday lives of middle-class families. And one of the things that we learned, which is not surprising to most of the people hanging out this morning, is that parents are very strategic and careful about organizing possible futures for their children, from the kinds of activities they do to the kinds of skills and expertise that they give them. Well, poor families, families with low-income backgrounds are also very interested and strategic, but they have less resources to leverage, right? And so that's why I think that our job in thinking about pathways is that learning should be the organization of possible futures, right? That part of our job as educators is to think about what new futures can we help design and support for these youth, because again, middle-class families have the resources to organize this all the time. And that's really a lot of our commitment to connected learning, is how do we build those connections and organize for them that are really important.
You also, I just want to say that in mentioning families and what families do, I think you've also made a comment that doesn't often come up when we think about what practitioners do, and that's this notion that we might actually also think about how we assist families in doing this desired sponsorship of their young person into possible futures. So another way to sort of think about family alliances, practitioner families.
I think that's a wonderful, wonderful point, and can't be minimized. So when we think about this work, one of the things that in the literature, in curriculum, we often do, and I think Anna was so wonderfully pointing out how not to do that, is how do we not make interest-driven a bridge to somewhere else? How do we say, this is wonderful, they're doing this. Now let's focus on the real stuff. And the real stuff is the stuff the school values, right? So those of us in the learning sciences really are pushing against that, because these everyday practices, these interest-driven practices, should be objects of study. They should be objects of analysis. They should be treated for their history and their value in the same way we would school-based kinds of genres and expertise, right? And I think that that's deeply missing in the way we design our classrooms, the way we design for leveraging interest-driven learning, right? We're still locked in those binaries, right? So how do we resist those binaries and start to think about interest-driven as fundamental to the kind of consequential learning that we want in schools, right? So in my own work that Elise knows, I've really been grappling with this. For over 15 years, I worked every summer here at UCLA with students from migrant farm worker backgrounds, high school students, right, who were extremely diverse learners. Some had a lot of experience and success with schools, others didn't. Some were fluent in English, some were not. Some were on traditional trajectories, some were not. And we brought them together, and my task was, how am I going to design an environment, an ecology, and a curriculum that can ratchet up learning for these youth so that they can come to the University of California. And so what I designed was something I call syncretic approach to learning. And I think, Anna, you were talking about the same kinds of things. And just for those who don't know, for me, syncretic means bringing together things that should be in tension with one another. So usually people think that interest-driven and school-based science are in tension with one another, right? So instead of resisting that binary, we would bring them together. And if I had been as savvy as Anna about how to use the screens, I would put up a PowerPoint to show you. But I'm glad to share it, because I actually have a strategy for how do we how do we start to leverage everyday and school-based practices to really develop rigorous kinds of learning, right? And what we saw in working with those migrant students every summer is that they developed robust forms of literacy that were valued both in their community as well as in the academy, right? And that's the kind of consequential literacy learning that I'm profoundly interested in, right? So that these youth could develop new identities, new stances towards learning, and who could really use the conventions of the academy to tell their stories and their histories in new ways, and that they could use their histories and stories, right, to give meaning and fodder for those academic pieces that they had to do.
And Kris, it's really wonderful work, and I feel like we need to have at some point a whole webinar just to look at that, because
I would love it. It would be so exciting.
Great. And a lot of implications there. We'll have a lot of people from CL MOOC and from NWP watching this. A lot of implications for literacy learning, because of course many of these practices are what we would think about as literacy practices, leveraging communicative culture in a socio-cultural way. So I think we need a deep dive on it, but I'm actually also wondering if this would be a great time to bring in Paul and Vanessa, because they're sort of engaged in an action project right now that we might want to get a feel for how it fits with this theme that Anna, you, and Kris have articulated.
Lise, can I just say one thing before you do? Because I'm actually working with some people at the Colorado Writing Project, Cindy Allen O'Donnell and Antero Garcia, who are going to we're going to collaborate to create some designer modules using a syncretic approach for a Common Core. So hopefully sometime in the next few months we'll have some of those designer modules.
And I think it's possible that Antero might even be in the chat room as we speak, or at least he was a little bit earlier, I think, or maybe on Twitter. So
he is.
Yeah, and that would be actually a lovely time to bring that work and these as demonstrations of what that looks like in curriculum work. That would be fabulous. Thanks, Kris. Paul and Vanessa, you have a lot to kind of layer your work on right now, but give us a sense of what it is that you all are working on at this second, and then we'll see how it fits.
I wanted to just go take a nap and listen to that again, but that was just kind of amazing, gotta say. You know, so Youth Voices is the center of a lot of the work this summer. And it isn't just a site. It's really an approach to learning that we've been developing over the years through the writing project and so forth. But starting with interest, so let me just try to be very simple, and then we'll kind of move out from there. One of the things that we learned several years ago was to follow James A. Bean's notion of asking 10 questions about yourself, 10 about the world. And what we've learned by so there's a tendency to then say, okay, so what is the academic connection with that? And we've avoided that. And so in the summertime, we're really able to avoid that and really ask kids to we really mean it. What are 10 deep questions you have about yourself? What are 10 questions you have about the world? And what we find when we do that is that, and when we sift through that and work with the themes around that, and they work together to find things together, is that they come up with amazing things. But they come up with things that there's no way we could predict. And that's something that feels worth saying. So two quick examples, and then that I'll mention is that one young woman is working on perfectionism, right? So who would have thought that perfectionism is a topic of concern? Like, no teacher's going to say, okay, our next unit is going to be on perfectionism, right? But if you go quickly, and there's a whole body of literature around that she can start developing and reading, and it connects very deeply with her, what she says in her own profile, pretty conservative religious home, right? So there's a real deep personal connection to her work, and we're helping her find, for lack of a better word, more academic connection in some way. That's one example. Another example is a young woman who came to us saying, I've written a novel. She's kind of amazing, and she wants to put her novel up on Youth Voices, and that's great. We can kind of do that. But we're also encouraging her. The question she came up with has to do with love and teenage love. And again, sounds like, okay, how do we deal with this? But so we've been asking, so why don't we just let her write her novel? So that's her passion. Thinking about last week, but what kind of interests can we develop now? And we're not sure we should ask her to do anything but work on her novel, but we are. And of course, her novel is about that too. So her exploration into these other kinds of texts that are about her topic are helping her think about what goes into her novel. So those are two quick examples. There are many other kinds of examples. And I guess that what I really want to say is that there's no way we could have predicted what kinds of topics kids come up with. It's really kind of fascinating. So that's one thing to say.
Just say that that's an interesting theme, starting with Anna about sort of the use of learning resources like annotation, let's say, and through Kris's pushing us to not dichotomize interests and academic consequential learning, let's say, not saying they're the same, but you're sort of pointing out, Paul, how actually the disciplines and the tools of the academy are analytic tools that help us as learners actually learn something and go deeper. So why not employ them to follow an interest in a way that goes farther than it would have without those tools?
I want to. Can I jump in real quick, Paul, too? Because I'm connecting with this as well. I'm currently working on a project as well, a design research project here in Action Research itself. Got students right out there that are coming into the lab right now. But we've now taken an approach where we're designing for possibility in our planning instead of designing for our outcomes. You know, whatever outcomes. And so I think it's that same approach, like you're saying. We've learned the same thing, right? We can't predict. And so we design for the possibility. And something that's coming up in the live stream too is something that I don't know if we've intentionally done or not, but it sounds like there's some understanding of that we're talking about certain pathways that are already established that youth go down. And I think what we're talking about, especially when you're talking about you can't predict where students are going with their learning or where the youth are going with their learning. So we're not talking about pathways as established pathways, but pathways that don't exist that they trailblaze. They're moving across. So I wanted to voice that and make sure that that's part of our conversation moving forward, because it's exactly what you're talking about with what youth can do.
So Paul, back at Youth Voices, where you can't predict and where things are emergent, then what?
Then what? Well, can I just let me just say that in our talking about the connected learning infographic. In our talking about that this summer, we kind of get the interest stuff and we kind of get the peer culture stuff really clearly. And then when we start talking about the academic, we start having arguments about what is that. But what really helps is this notion of identity and being. What are young people becoming? And so, Anna, you mentioned that early on, and I think others did too here. But so that feels like an important part. Like, how to talk about, what kind of thinker and doer are you becoming? Feels like a way to deepen things out of interest. So that's worth saying. Yeah. So where do we want to go next? Good answer. Jump in. Or how do we want?
So I'm the mad learning scientist at Peer-to-Peer University. Which means that I am a product manager for the site p2pu.org. I design the features for learning amongst peer learners. And what, learning pathways, what that means when you translate it into software features is discoverability. We talk a lot about discoverability in the user experience world. The way that we have structured discoverability of new projects and other learners at p2pu.org is that once you give feedback to someone on P2PU, you always follow whatever projects they're working on in the future. If you give feedback to someone at PPU, that means you guys have the same skill sets. You have mastered the same skill sets in HTML5. You've mastered the same skill sets in art history. But the way that we prompt that discoverability in future learning pathways is that you're always keeping one eye on someone that either you've gotten feedback from or someone who you've given feedback to. So you take that HTML5, and now someone is working on menu design, and now someone is working on an animated GIF about shoes. And that is how we use a social discoverability mechanism to help for those emergent pathways. But I also wanted to say we did an interest-driven activity today with Paul's students with varying degrees of success in creating badges. Did you want to talk about that at all, or?
Talk about it. So
No.
here's no.
Oh, okay.
What I gotta say is really exciting about the PPU platform around badges is how radically sort of learner-centered it is. But the badges that I've been messing with up until this point have been I would say, are kind of top-down. So I don't know how to leap into this conversation, but so this summer to think about young people nominating and talking about what are the things we're learning and kind of creating their own badges around that, but then also constantly thinking about, okay, how can we make those count in some way, has a lot of similarity to the earlier conversations here between how do you start with interest and then end up somewhere. So that's kind of what we're struggling with or working with this summer.
And certainly the whole interest, well, not the whole of it, but much of the interest in badges is to have something that is not so narrowly, back to what we were talking about in terms of the metaphor, so narrowly defined in terms of steps along an achievement pathway, let's say, and have something that could actually spread more broadly and let people move through different ways, through, along different kinds of self-determined rhizomatic pathways, but still be able to land in a few places and name for themselves an achievement and name for others an achievement or a target perhaps that they've set. So that sort of moving from a linear path to an array of something is kind of visually what a lot of people are trying to do with badges.
I'll say that Paul, in his reflection with the students at the end of the day, he asked, so what do badges mean to you now? And someone said identity. And I thought that was really great because that means that it is emergent. Yeah.
So just a concrete example, I got to say that one of the groups that came up with, there were really fascinating badges they came up with, but one of them was sleepy time poetry. So poetry that would be good to use to have a child go to sleep, for example. Like, who would have predicted that as a badge? But anyway.
And you're working with youth themselves to define some targets like those that they find interesting to play with.
Yeah. And can I push the conversation a little bit further? We're not there yet with the technology and working all this out. But correct me, but Doug Valshaw's notion of web literacies or standards, and those standards having, I think it's competencies, having skills within them, and then having URLs attached to them. So so it's my hope that you can start with student-generated badges, but then you can say, okay, so here's a list of these skills that somebody thinks are really important, right? Somebody, but and so are there any of those skills that attach to your badge? And can we say, okay, yes, it's about sleepy time poetry, but it's also identifying this skill that's kind of been that Mozilla says is important, or the New York City Writing Project says is important. So some combination of that is what we're kind of excited about exploring.
Yeah. So we have really just about 10 minutes left in this really wonderful conversation. I want to be able to throw it open to all of you for just some open conversation. And I know a number of you have been looking at what's been going on in the chat line, so there may be some things that people want to respond to or pick up there. But I thought I would just throw out one provocation in a way in our conversation, and I think also in the chat, in a way that I fully understand and resonate with. We've been spending a fair amount of time trying to make room for the emergent possible in the learner's life. And I have also, though, in my brain, a lot of some of those families, for example, that may have come up earlier, for example, when Kris was talking, who say, yeah, but it's sort of a luxury for some people to simply dwell in the emergent possible. I would like to know how I can help my child, or how a learner can say how I myself can actually negotiate from where I am to somewhere I would like to be. Which does kind of talk in that sort of question does open up some questions about how we might create pathways to say, if you want to go there, here's how you get there. Here are some paths you could pursue. Sort of what middle-class families are working very hard to organize for their kids. So I'm throwing that out as a provocation because we've spent some time on where I know my heart goes pity-pat, which is actually about learner-drivenness. But there is also this larger society. I wonder if anybody wants to pick up on any of those themes.
Well, I wanted to just chime in, I guess, add to this provocation here. That there's also this, I guess, this hidden curriculum in schools that a lot of youth come out having learned. There's a learned passivity about what it means to be a learner and what it means to work in our world. That my job is to wait and be told, and then live up to that expectation. And so, and I think that's so. Not only is it a privilege to be able to have, like you said, live in the emergent possible, but it's also we also teach the opposite oftentimes in our formalized structures. And yeah.
So some unlearning might be necessary for people to really actualize an interest or a direction for themselves. Yeah.
I love the theme of learning and designing for the future. You know, there's a term, prolepsis. That's what you're learning for the future, and I don't think we want to let go of that. But I don't think that's in contradiction with interest-driven at all. I mean, I think we need to think more about these are hybrid practices. They're always hybrid practices where I'm leveraging the interest-driven, but I'm also making visible the skills and conventions of those genres so that they're not antithetical to multiple possibilities, right? So I think we want to think about multiple pathways, not just one. And if we think about our youth live polycultural lives, right? They're polylingual. And so we want to think about our practices really exemplifying that polycultural, polylingual, polymodal kind of way of life. And I think when you do that and you develop these hybrid practices, you don't end up saying, this is good for this and this is good for school, but here are the kinds of robust practices that give meaning to who I am, but also have so many affordances for helping me develop some authoritative voice, whether it's about things that I like outside of school or whether it's things I like in school. So I don't think that they're antithetical at all. If we start to think about the really robust practices are always hybrid in nature.
Authoritative voice makes me want to say, makes me want to bring you and Paul and Vanessa, because in a way you can see over time young people and youth voices developing stronger authority around something that a project they take on.
Yeah, I wasn't. Let me go somewhere a little bit differently. So, and it's about. I think it comes under shared purpose, and it may seem strange, but one of the things we are in this Youth Voices Summer program, we have 15. We're down one or so, but we have students, 15 students and 5 teachers, and that's how we designed it. And what's been really interesting, because we thought that would be good for the teachers to sit alongside the students, but what happened, because we already have an ongoing community of students on Youth Voices, is that most of the students for the summer program came from teachers who are already using Youth Voices, and students are already on Youth Voices, and some of those teachers came into this program too. So we have teachers and students who are already working together in their schools, like giving each other hugs at the end of the day. So it seems really, when we're thinking about middle class and struggling communities, or however we want to define those communities, working with both the young people and the teachers at the same time, if that's possible, is really a remarkable thing to be able to do. Because when a young person doesn't show up, we can have the teacher call the parent. And they're like, there's already this relationship. So that kind of network that happens is really kind of interesting. Beyond the kind of learning that happens alongside, there's this social networking that feels really important.
Well, I think that's really important. We've been working a lot with our novice teachers, putting them in making and tinkering spaces, working side by side with youth. And what's so important about that as a learning space for both new teachers and students as learning side by side is that they get to see the ingenuity at work when youth are engaged in these practices. And it really reminds us that, you know, the classroom is such a black box. It's real hard for people to have a different pedagogical imagination about the classroom, and having new teachers again enjoying the activity around making and tinkering has just afforded such wonderful possibilities. And then we're trying to bring in school kinds of things, and we've had some wonderful success bringing in iRemix with making and tinkering, so that students are always producing, representing, writing, blogging, and again extending their repertoires. And it's been so important for our young teachers to see the possibilities in these spaces and the role of new media, right, to help extend not just interest-driven but also school-based kinds of learning.
And Kris, that was great. Back to our very first webinar in this series, which was looking at writing and making. So that was a perfect reference. In the last couple minutes we have, actually, Anna, I kind of want to bring you back in for a last comment. In addition to having kicked us off, this last thread, I would say, Kris and Paul, you've had me thinking about what a metaphor could be that reimagines what we're trying to do with Pathway, but embodies it in people and culture and practices. Mm-hmm. Because actually people in older youth induct younger youth into the culture of youth voices, mm-hmm. for example, or the way that in the making and tinkering space there's mentorship and kind of cultural work and identity and social work. Anna, you actually referenced the importance of those mentors as you watched young people. So you had a very cultural view of the path. It was marked with people and identity. So I want to throw it to you for maybe some last
Yeah, definitely. It's a pathway through something, right? It's a pathway through multiple contexts. It's just that it's not just a pathway through time, which is I think why we think, I've heard trajectory before, which I find far more linear than pathway, which is why I've kind of leaned toward pathway a little bit more. But the youth really are making their learning, right, as across multiple spaces, and we're involved. It doesn't displace, you know, our institutional goals, and you know, as teachers, as mentors, we aren't, you know, when we're focusing on how the learner's doing it, we're not a part of that. We're definitely a part of it. We're the pathway we're along the pathway with them, like Paul was talking about, side by side with them. And I was thinking as they were talking, just behind me, I was realizing maybe it's this way. Behind me, I realized that I had my poster of design elements that I've been teaching in the last couple of days in our writing designing lab, and right next to it is a practice that some of our youth have started to do, which they've been putting up quotes of the day from the reading that they've been doing, and that was a practice that they started on their own. And I think that is a real nice way to end here with you, what you're talking about. This isn't a learner off on their own making without having opportunities with affordances right around with them. that that they're drawing from the context that they're in. It's a pathway through something, and with someone.
Wow, thank you all. What an amazing conversation for an hour. Thank you. And it's a perfect lead in actually to next week's webinar, and I hope that folks will join us again. This theme of individuals, but individuals are in culture, in practices, in community, is a nice segue into our final webinar in this series. The theme of which is moving from voice to impact. And for those of us in the literacy community, we spend a lot of time thinking about voice, developing voice, authoritative voice, but individual voice, collective impact, we want to look at that question, people in their cultures and in their practices. For this webinar, by tomorrow, there should be a full recording of this webinar, and other content, for example, the chat room and links, other curated content will be up on the web at connectedlearning.tv. So please share that out with your networks and point them to it. We would love to have many people accessing it also after the fact. And we don't want the conversations to end here if you've been with us live. So keep this energy going. It's a wonderful and really fascinating chat roll that's happening. Feel free to join the Connected Learning G+ community and to follow the conversation there. Use the hashtag Connected Learning as well. And this Connected Learning MOOC, the hashtag CLMOOC, is still going on in G+, on blogs, and sort of distributed all over the web, as CMOOCs tend to be. Feel free to jump in. The motto at CLMOOC is "You're never late" at the CLMOOC. You can see that that's the community motto. This Thursday, July 18, at 10 to 11 Pacific, we're going to revisit this conversation within a Twitter chat using the hashtag literacies. And then next Tuesday, July 23rd, the same time slot, 10 Pacific time. Come on back to live stream and watch the next webinar on Connected Learning TV. Thank you, everyone. Guests, thank you. Fabulous, wonderful folks in the chat. Much appreciated.
Thanks.